She was still warm when they buried her. The frost had already reached her feet, threading between her toes like it meant to keep her there, beneath the earth, forever. No prayers, no names, just the wet thud of dirt meeting skin, and the breath of those who believed this was the only way to survive the winter. Somewhere above, the alder tree groaned, not from wind, from memory. They told themselves it was mercy, that she'd been chosen, that the curse required balance, and she was pure enough to tip the scale. But what they buried that night wasn't a child. It was guilt, layered in silence, packed with trembling hands. And when it was done, they walked away, thinking the ground would keep their secret. It didn't. The frost didn't melt that spring, not in the northern quarter, not near the tannery fields. It stayed, clinging to windows and well stones, curling like veins through the dirt. The sun came back. But not here. And the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was debt. There were no birds that season, no laughter from porches, no sound at all, save for the creak of boards and the low groan of wood that hadn't shifted in months. Something was watching, not from the trees, from underneath. And the town of Salem, already grey with history, felt it, like breath rising from a locked room. What they had done was not ancient. It wasn't myth. It was recent, documented, deliberate, a decision made with open eyes. And now, the frost had come to collect. They buried an orphan girl to cleanse their curse. But curses remember. The silence came before the sickness, before the cattle dropped, before the children began walking in their sleep. It began as a quiet that stretched just a little too long between footsteps. The absence of birdsong, the missing clang of a farrier's hammer, no laughter from porches, no cries from infants. Even the church bell, long rusted into stillness, emed to pull the air tighter around it. At first no one noticed, but the stillness grew until it swallowed sound entirely. Doors shut without echo. Water poured into buckets with no splash. You could scream in the northern quarter, and only your breath would hear it. People began speaking in whispers without knowing why, afraid their voices might be overheard by something beneath them. It wasn't just quiet. It was pressure. A low, dense tension that settled in the lungs like coal dust. Elders who had survived the winter of '09 said this silence felt heavier, thicker. Children flinched at empty corners. Dogs refused to bark. And no one, not even the ministers, could finish a prayer without forgetting how it began. It wasn't that sound had vanished. It was that something had taken it, swallowed it whole, as if the ground itself had no use for noise anymore, as if it were listening for something else. People tried to fill the silence with busy work, chopping wood, hammering fences, humming at the hearth. But everything they did felt muted, meaningless, and oddly rehearsed, like actors performing for an audience that had already left. No one spoke of the girl. Not yet. Not directly. But her absence sat like a weight at the edge of every sentence. The frost had not melted, and the quiet had not lifted, and though no one would admit it, they had all started to feel it, that the silence was not passive. It had intent. It was not simply the absence of sound. It was the arrival of something that wanted none of it, something that had been fed once, and was listening now for the next offering. The animals were the first to fall, not from blood, not from bite, but from something far stranger, something still. They didn't cry out, didn't thrash. They simply stopped. Mid-step, mid-breath. Cows toppled in the field with no wound to mark, eyes wide and glassy, tongues lolling out as if death had caught them mid-thought. Chickens died on their roosts without flapping. Horses collapsed as if sleep had betrayed them. No foam, no fever, just stillness, spreading through the farms like rot beneath the skin. At first the townsfolk blamed the cold, but frost doesn't take without warning. This did. A man would rise to milk his goats and find them already stiff, eyes pointing east toward the alder. Dogs began refusing food. Cats vanished entirely, and every time someone reached for explanation, their voice failed just before saying her name. Marjorie. They had not yet admitted it aloud, but already they felt it. What they'd buried had not stayed buried. The men who dug the hole reported nothing unusual, but the land around the alder grew warm for days after, steaming faintly even in full frost. And now it pulsed with absence. Not death. Absence. Like something beneath had drawn the life downward, gently, invisibly, like a hand under water pulling down one breath at a time. The fields grew quiet. Not just because the animals had died, but because no one dared replace them. A farmer lost his entire coop and set out traps thinking foxes had come. Nothing was caught. Another man tried to move his livestock to higher ground. All three owed. If his oxen fell dead on the trail without a sound. The ground wasn't sick, it was hungry. Not for meat, not for flesh, for life in motion, for breath, for heat. And now it had learned to take without violence, without warning, without permission. The town had given it blood once. Now it was testing the edges of that agreement, seeing how far the silence could stretch before it tore open again. Every animal that died was a reminder, every still body a soft knock from beneath the soil. Not loud, not angry, just insistent, like something asking, quietly, if it was time yet. For another. It began with a stillbirth, then another, then 5 in a single week. The women of Salem, strong from hardship and seasoned in loss, began to bleed early. Too early. Their bellies, once full with promise, grew quiet. The midwives came and went with blood on their hands, and no explanations in their mouths. They spoke only in glances now, tight-lipped, red-knuckled, hollow-eyed. The babies that came, when they came, arrived grey, limp, with eyes that never opened. Some mothers didn't cry. They simply stared at the swaddled silence and turned their faces to the wall. Others screamed until their voices cracked, then never spoke again. The cribs that had been carved in joy were never used. Blankets went unused. Names that had been whispered in the womb were swallowed into nothing, and all across the northern quarter, something thick and ancient curled through the silence like smoke. The ministers tried to explain it with scripture, the doctors with bad air and spoiled milk, but none of their words could explain why every miscarriage occurred within sight of the alder. Why no mother living near the field made it past her 6th month, or why the ground near the tree always seemed wet, warm, like it had already known what they would lose. Some began to wonder aloud whether the price had been miscalculated, whether Marjorie's death had not satisfied whatever debt lingered in the soil. Or worse, whether her offering had awakened a hunger that could no longer be contained to one child every 7 years. They didn't say it, but they felt it. She hadn't ended the curse. She'd fed it, and now it wanted more. The women carried their grief silently, stooping at wells with red-rimmed eyes and hollow bodies. No one asked. No one offered condolences. In Salem, sorrow was private. And what they feared now wasn't just loss. It was pattern, precision. Something older than sin and colder than guilt moving just beneath their feet, tracking bloodlines, measuring time, waiting for the next breath to falter, the next womb to close. And always in the quiet of night, the frost thickened near the cooper's shed. Even now, long emptied, long forgotten, The ground still whispered. It had taken something once, and it was learning how to take again. The fires were lit early that year. Logs stacked high in the meeting-house hearth, flames crackling from dawn until dusk, fed by hands that had begun to tremble without reason. But no matter how fiercely it burned, the cold clung to the room like a second skin. Not the kind of cold that prickled the flesh, but the kind that seeped inward, bone deep, heavy, wrong. People came bundled in wool and left shivering. Breath hung in the air long after the fires roared. Even the hymnals, bound in cracked leather and left near the pulpit, felt damp to the touch. One Sunday a woman fainted mid-sermon, then a child, then the minister himself. They said it was the smoke, poor ventilation, maybe mould in the stone. But no one believed it. Not really. The room wasn't just cold. It was being emptied, slowly, quietly, like the air itself no longer wanted to stay, like the warmth was being pulled somewhere else. Some claimed it was the wind, creeping in through unseen cracks, swirling low to the ground where the pews met the floor. But those who sat closest said otherwise. They said the cold came from beneath. That when they placed their feet flat on the wood, they felt it, something rising from the foundation. Not a draft, a presence. The walls began to sweat, even in sub-zero air. Candles refused to hold flame longer than minutes at a time, and always, in the silence between verses, there was the sound of wood shifting, not above, not beside, but under, as though the very beams were shrinking away from the weight of what waited below. One night, the entire congregation stood in silence, unable to begin the service. No one opened the scripture. No one rang the bell. They simply sat, staring at the altar as the frost spread inward from the corners of the room, inching toward the pulpit like a tide returning to claim something long abandoned. No voices rose that night, no prayers offered, just the slow awareness settling into every chest that whatever they had tried to bury was still moving. And now it had found a way in, not through the doors, not through the walls, but up through the floor, into the house meant to hold their faith. And still, no one said her name. The page was buried deep in the church's archive, tucked between baptismal records from 1811 and a marriage license no one remembered. It was brittle, brown-edged, and entirely blank, except for one single line of text struck through with thick black ink that had bled into the fibers. It wasn't the ink that disturbed the elder who found it. It was the precision. Not a careless stroke, not a spill, but an intentional erasure. Something meant to be removed, forgotten, sealed. He held the page to the light. Letters barely showed through, faint, curling. The name was unreadable, but the word below it survived. Reckoning. No date, no context. Just that word. The rest of the page was covered in what looked like smudges. But the elder knew better. These were fingerprints, pressed into the paper as if someone had tried to claw the ink off long after it had dried. His breath caught. Because beneath the layer of ink and time, something pulsed. Not physically, but in memory. Like the paper itself carried weight or warning. The ledger it came from had dozens of other pages, all neatly organized. Baptisms, births, names of the living recorded with care. But this one entry had been hidden, deliberately misplaced, sealed between folds as if to muffle its voice. And the more he stared at it, the more he remembered. Not facts, not stories, but a feeling. From years ago. The seventh win, when his mother stopped speaking, when the girl from the cooper's shed disappeared and no one asked where she'd gone. He had been young, but the frost had crept up the windows differently that year. And this page, this blacked-out line, was from that winter. He placed it back without reading further, Not out of fear, but out of instinct. Because some records weren't made for remembering. They were made for burying. The ink hadn't been used to obscure a name. It had been used to seal a truth. And now that truth was beginning to press upward again, through paper, through floorboards, through frost. He told no one about the page. But that night, he salted his doorway. Not out of superstition, out of memory. Because even if he couldn't read the name, he knew exactly who it had been. Salem was never clean. It was never innocent. It was founded on a cut that never scabbed, built atop land that had already been spoken for, by people long driven out, by promises never honored, by bones never blessed. The town's early ledgers spoke in proud tones of expansion, of survival, of divine providence. But in the margins of the oldest maps, drawn before the ink had fully dried, there were marks no one now explains. Circles around the alder grove, names scratched out, boundaries crossed and redrawn. What the founding pages don't mention is what was taken before the first stone was laid. The clearing where the tannery now rotted had once been a place of burial, not European. Older, marked by carved stones with no crosses and pits filled with ash and shell. The first settlers knew this. They built anyway. A chapel, a granary, and then the field where the alder grew. Some said the tree had stood there long before the soil was cleared. Others whispered it had grown overnight, but all agreed. It bled when cut, and still they stayed. The land gave crops, even in frost. Game never ran scarce. Illnesses passed over their houses, and no child died in childbirth for 7 straight winters. They called it blessing. But there were rumors, quiet patterns, whispers that every few years a stranger went missing. A child wandered into the woods and never returned. No grave, no markers, just the quiet sense that something had been paid and something had accepted. When the church bell was hung, the clapper cracked once. A sign, some said. Others disagreed. But even in disagreement, no one rang it again. The town grew outward, but not north. Never north. That direction was avoided, left as open field. And at the edge, always, the alder remained. No fence was built. None was needed. They knew. Even as they built schools and walls and roads, Salem grew like a body learning how to carry its shame. The pact was not spoken. It didn't need to be. It lived in the rhythm of their lives, in the way they counted winters, in the silence that followed each 7th year. It was not a curse. It was a contract. And Salem had signed in silence. It started to bleed again in early frost. Not sap, not water, but something darker, thicker, oozing from the trunk in slow, steady threads. The alder near the tannery had always been strange, but now it wept with purpose. At first it was dismissed as a natural illness. Trees can leak under stress. They can rot from the inside, but no birds land it on its branches. No insects touched its bark. The air around it felt wrong, sweet, but metallic, warm even when the wind froze the ground. And those who got close enough said it didn't smell like sap. It smelled like blood. Not fresh, but old, stale, like the inside of a sealed room that had seen too much grief. The ground beneath it was soft, even in deep frost. A child stepped there once and sank to the ankles before his father pulled him back. The boy was silent for days after, and when he finally spoke, he whispered, "She's still down there." The alder's roots cracked through the nearby stones, widening like fingers pushing outward. The wall they'd built decades earlier began to buckle just slightly, enough to remind. And with every nightfall, the sap crept lower, drawing patterns along the bark, thin, vein-like tendrils that glistened red beneath the moon. no one dared cut it. Not anymore. A farmer once took a small branch for firewood. By morning, his sheep were dead and his well had soured. He moved away without collecting his final pay. The alder wasn't diseased. It was remembering, not in thought, but in presence. The same way old wounds sometimes ache before a storm. The tree was older than any grave in Salem, older than the church, and those who listened closely said it groaned, not from wind, but from something internal, a kind of tension in the grain, as if it had been holding something for too long. The tree knew what they had done. It had been the witness, the vessel, the marker. And now it was starting to respond. The bleeding was not a warning. It was a signal, a call, a reminder that something had been planted beneath it, not a seed, but a sacrifice. And the roots had fed well. She died with her eyes open. The last midwife in the northern quarter, known for her calm hands and salt-touched hair, collapsed mid-delivery. No illness, no warning. One moment she was guiding a cry into the world. The next, she froze, mouth parted, eyes locked on a spot behind the mother's shoulder, as if something had entered the room that no one else could see. The child was stillborn. The mother bled for hours and never woke. When they lifted the midwife's body, her skin was cold but not pale. Her veins had darkened. Her fingertips, they said, were wet. Not with blood. With something thicker. The tools she'd used were clean, too clean, as if they'd been washed in something caustic. Her satchel, usually organized with care, was missing every record she'd kept on deliveries from the past decade. Not misplaced. Removed. Her ledger was found days later beneath the floorboards of the meeting house, pages torn from the spine, most of them blank, save for a single repeated line written in uneven ink. Not again, not again, not again. No one knew what she'd seen, but some recalled her change in recent weeks. The way she began pausing before entering homes. The salt she started sprinkling under each threshold. The hymns she hummed between labored breaths. She had helped birth more than 50 children in her lifetime. But this one, this birth, had been different. There were no signs of struggle on her body. No stroke, no seizure, just that stare. Hollow. Stretched wide by something between terror and recognition. Those who saw her before burial swore her pupils had faded to white, as if bleached by what she'd witnessed. The townsfolk didn't speak of her after that. A new midwife was brought in from Marblehead, younger, unfamiliar with the frost that curled at the edges of Salem's records. But even she didn't stay long. Said the rooms felt too still. Said the ground was too soft. Said the dreams came on her second night and didn't stop. She left without taking her pay. The old midwife's grave was never marked. No stone, no name. Just a patch of earth behind the tannery near the alder. And the frost there never left. It began as a murmur in the schoolhouse. A child, no older than 7, recited a phrase no one had taught her. Not from a book. Not from home. She whispered it while staring at the frost forming on the window pane, her voice flat, steady, as if repeating something etched behind her eyelids. The teacher froze. She'd heard the words before, not recently, but as a child herself, during a winter when the wells soured and the frost returned early. It was a pattern, a chant, not a prayer, older than that. The phrase was simple, rhythmic, but wrong in the way children sometimes sing songs they don't understand. The teacher asked where she'd learned it. The girl just shrugged, said she'd heard it in a dream. The next day, 3 more students repeated the same phrase. By the end of the week, it had passed through the town like smoke, spoken by children and elders alike, not always aloud, but mouthed, like a reflex. Someone found the phrase in an old ledger from 1714, scrawled beside the names of livestock that had been bled out during a hard winter. No explanation, just the words and a symbol, a circle with a single stroke cutting upward through its center. That symbol was later found carved beneath the pulpit, long hidden under layers of wax and paint. Not decorative. Intentional. Like a seal. The phrase itself wasn't Latin, nor anything recognizable, but the cadence was familiar, like lullabies meant to soothe or sedate. A minister who heard it fell to his knees mid-sermon, clutching his chest, weeping without knowing why. The town began to remember in pieces, fragments, memories passed like illness. A woman dreamed of a procession in the snow, hands bound, mouths closed. A man woke to find dirt beneath his fingernails and couldn't recall where he'd walked that night. They were not being cursed. They were being reminded. Not of something spoken, but something practiced, something done, again and again, and buried. The ritual had no name because it was never written, only remembered by those who had no choice. And now, that rhythm was crawling back, through breath, through frost, through language forgotten by design. The land doesn't need a voice. It only needs a pat, turn. And Salem had walked this one before. The logic arrived quietly, like rot behind a wall, unspoken, unchallenged, but fully formed. The curse had returned. The signs were clear, and if something needed to be fed, then the offering had to be pure, not just innocent, but untouched, unloved, a soul unspoiled by sin, yet unmoored from kin. The math of it settled into the town's bones like frost in timber. The elders didn't meet. The ministers didn't preach. But the decision took shape all the same, shared in glances across pews, in the way hands lingered over family trees, in the sudden scrutiny of every child who didn't belong. It couldn't be a mother's daughter, couldn't be a blacksmith's son. The offering had to be clean of attachments, free of defense. Not because they hated her, but because she was the only one the land would accept. That's how they justified it. That's how they slept. They told themselves it was theology, that the curse demanded balance, and only the absence of love could balance the weight of their survival. It wasn't punishment. It was math. They began looking for signs. A bird's feather found at a doorstep. Milk that curdled too quickly. A cry in the night with no mouth behind it. They weren't searching for guilt. They were searching for permission. Proof that what they were already willing to do was somehow necessary. And when none came, they decided silence was its own kind of consent. The girl was chosen not because she was wrong, but because she was right for the role. Quiet, pale, forgotten even while living among them. A soul that hadn't yet taken root in anyone's heart. And that made her perfect. She had no sins to account for, no lineage to grieve her, no one who would write her name in stone when she was gone. To them, she was still clay, soft enough to give back without leaving a dent. And so they began preparing, not aloud, but inwardly, pacing their breaths, counting the days until the frost fully settled. And though they didn't say her name, everyone knew. They'd fed the land before, and now it had come knocking again, not with rage, but with quiet. And the only thing more terrifying than a curse is when the whole town agrees to answer it. She was never truly part of Salem, not in the way others were. Marjorie had arrived too young to remember where she came from, and too quietly to be missed. No one took her in, not fully. She wasn't adopted, baptized, or claimed. She was placed. Housed in the abandoned cooper's shed near the edge of the field, where the alder tree's shadow stretched longest at dusk. They gave her blankets in winter, scraps in summer, and the kind of attention reserved for animals, enough to survive, but never enough to grow. She learned early how to go unseen, moved softly, spoke rarely, kept her hands folded and her eyes lowered, as though she understood from the start that being noticed was dangerous, and so the town noticed her absence more than her presence. When she wandered too close to homes, shutters would close. When she passed the churchyard, conversations paused until her footsteps faded. She was not hated. That would have meant emotion. She was nothing. A shadow at the edges, a face without a story. Her clothes were always too thin, her hair never quite clean, and yet she never asked for more. She sat by the tannery fence most days, carving circles into the dirt with the heel of her shoe. Watching, waiting. For what? No one knew. Some said she hummed to herself, old lullabies no one else remembered. Others claimed they'd seen her whisper to the alder, leaning close as if listening for an answer. No one knew who taught her to read, but she carried a Bible with torn pages and underlined verses, always clutched tight, even in sleep. When sickness came through town and took 3 mothers in 1 week, she didn't cry. When the first frost arrived early that year and the livestock dropped, she simply looked to the field and didn't blink. Some said that's when the town began to truly fear her, not because she brought misfortune, but because she survived it. Alone, unloved, untouched. A soul outside the ledger, outside protection, outside grief. And when the 7th winter came and the frost refused to melt, everyone looked toward the cooper's shed without speaking. Not because they believed she was guilty, but because they believed she would be accepted. They saw her before the bad things happened, not inside, never inside, always just outside the window, reflected in the glass like breath. A pale shape, hair uncombed, fingers resting on the sill but never knocking. Marjorie never moved when they spotted her, just stood there, still as frost, watching the inside of a life she'd never been allowed to have. One family swore she appeared the night before their cow collapsed mid-calving. Another claimed they saw her face in the reflection of the window above the crib, hours before the baby went still. No proof. No footprints in the snow. Just the impression of presence, heavy and hollow, as if she had been summoned, not sent. The whispers started in corners. She's bringing it with her. She's marked. She's drawing the curse in like a wick drinks oil. Mothers started pulling children away when she passed. Fathers left tools unfinished just to close a door between her and their homes. Marjorie never spoke of it, never denied. She simply went on walking the town's edges, same time each day, same route. Past the chapel, past the well, past the schoolhouse where she'd once been turned away. Some said she was tracing something. Others said she didn't even know she was doing it. But after every tragedy, her shape returned in the next pane of glass, as if sorrow had its own reflection, and it wore her face. One morning, a child screamed that Marjorie had been inside the mirror, not outside it. That her mouth was moving, but no sound came. That her eyes were wet with black. No one confirmed it. No one needed to. The fear was already seeded, the pattern already believed. She had become the ghost they needed her to be. Not a threat, an omen. And in Salem, omens were never questioned, only interpreted. They didn't accuse her. They didn't confront. They simply watched her more closely, tracking her steps, memorizing her path, waiting for the moment it would all make enough sense to act, not in anger, but in necessity. Because by then, the town had made up its mind. If the curse had a shape, it was hers. No meeting was ever held. No vote was taken. But still, every soul in Salem came to the same conclusion. Marjorie had to be the one. The frost had thickened, the cribs had emptied, the alder had bled again, and she, always there, always watching, had become the figure they could assign it all to. They never said it aloud, not in full. Only half sentences, unfinished thoughts, eyes that met and turned away. A question left hanging in the smoke above a hearth. A name trailed off just before the final consonant. It wasn't hatred that sealed her fate. It was weariness, the kind that comes after too many winters without warmth. They needed it to end. And the only thing more terrifying than burying a child was letting the curse linger one more year. So the town settled into its silent rhythm. A hush fell over the market stalls. Candles were lit earlier than usual, not out of reverence, but to cast shorter shadows. Children were kept indoors, not for safety, but so they wouldn't ask questions. The ministers said nothing. The elders said less. But the frost spoke volumes. It grew thicker around the cooper's shed, the windows fogging from the outside in. Bread left on her doorstep disappeared faster than usual. Her footprints stayed in the snow longer than anyone else's, as if the land had already begun marking her path. When she passed in the street, no one met her gaze, not out of cruelty, but from a shared conviction they dared not examine too closely. They told themselves it was justice, that the balance required purity, that the land needed someone who didn't belong. But what they really meant was this: she was the only one left who could die without breaking anything. No mothers would mourn her, no family would curse the town. And so they watched her with quiet precision, tracking the last days like a slow procession before the execution no one wanted to admit was coming. They didn't tie her up. They didn't scream. That would have made it real. Instead, they waited for the frost to peak, for the alder to weep, for the silent agreement to take shape in action. In Salem, they didn't need to speak their sins. They just needed to repeat them. They came for her after dusk, not in a mob, not in anger, just a quiet collection of figures moving as one, faces half-shadowed by lamplight, boots muffled by frost. There were no shouts, no orders, no chains, only the sound of breath, controlled, shallow, as if speaking aloud might wake something beneath the earth. Marjorie didn't run. She didn't resist. When they knocked at the cooper's shed, she opened the door and stood still, her Bible in hand, her hair tangled with sleep. No one told her what to do, but she followed. Past the tannery, where the ground had grown soft, past the empty fields, toward the alder, which loomed in the dark like a figure in mourning. They moved in pairs, but no one touched her, no one led. It was as if the town itself had begun walking, and the bodies were only vessels, and as for a will they no longer questioned. Some averted their eyes. Others watched her feet, careful not to meet the expression on her face. But she didn't cry, didn't speak, just moved, step by step, as if she'd known all along this night would come. One child peeked from behind a shutter, and would later whisper that she was glowing, that the frost around her ankles hadn't stuck, and the ground hadn't held her footprints. But no one else saw it. They didn't look closely. They couldn't. To look at her too long might have cracked the spell of justification, might have reminded them she was still just a girl. The closer they came to the tree, the colder the air became. Not wind, not temperature. A cold that thickened in the lungs, that made the eyes sting and the knees want to buckle. When they reached the alder, no one gave instruction. The tools had already been left there earlier. The soil had already been turned. There was a hush, not reverent, not sacred, but resigned. One final exhale before a silence too deep for memory. Marjorie stepped forward, not pulled, not dragged, and the town, as one, stepped back. They would not bury her yet. But this was the moment they gave her away. In Salem, guilt wore no faces, only shadows. And this procession, like everyone before it, left no footprints behind. They laid her down without a word. The hollow had already been dug, deep, narrow, lined with alder roots that pulsed damp against the frozen soil. No cloth wrapped her, no coins for eyes. Just Marjorie, arms folded over her chest, eyes half open, staring through the dark as if waiting for a sound only she could hear. The ground around her steamed faintly, warm despite the frost, as if the land had been prepared, hungry, expectant. The townsfolk stood in a wide ring, not close enough to see her face, not far enough to claim ignorance. The minister did not speak. The bell did not ring. Instead, the silence grew thick, the kind that fills the lungs with stone. And then came the first handful of dirt. Soft, measured, not thrown, not heaved, placed. Then another, then another. They took turns, not looking at her, not looking at each other, like mourners at a funeral no one dared name. But this was no burial. This was a binding, a sealing. The moment her chest was covered, the alder groaned, loud, wet, splitting. Not like wind through branches, but like breath pushing through lungs that hadn't moved in years. A sound that came from inside the tree, from the roots, from beneath. The ground didn't shake. It pulled, as if accepting the offering with care, as if tucking her into the soil like something returned, not stolen, not lost, but reclaimed. When the hole was filled, no stone was placed. No marker, just a circle of frost that did not fade, even as the rest of the snow began to melt around it. The townspeople left as they had come, slow, silent, certain. Not a word spoken on the walk back. Not a glance exchanged. The air had shifted. The hunger had been answered. And Marjorie, who had never belonged, never been held, never been named in any ledger, was now part of the ground itself. Not gone. Not dead. Just beneath. Beneath the alder. Beneath the earth. Beneath the silence that Salem had carried for generations. And, though no one said it, everyone felt it in their marrow as they walked away. The land had accepted her. For now. By morning the frost had begun to lift. Not slowly, not with the natural rhythm of thaw, but all at once, like a sheet being peeled from glass. The windows of the northern quarter cleared before dawn. The wells no longer steamed. The soil underfoot no longer crunched. And for the first time in weeks, the birds returned, one by one, then in flocks, filling the branches with their trivial, beautiful noise. A child was born that afternoon, full-voiced and pink-skinned, his mother weeping not from grief, but from relief. The cow that had refused to eat now stood, chewing lazily. The hens laid again. And a warm breeze pushed through the tannery path, bending the tall grass like something exhaling after a long-held breath. The town did not celebrate. There were no gatherings, no hymns of thanks, just quiet nods. Doors reopened, tools were lifted, life resumed. But not as before. The people moved with a strange grace now, gentler, more deliberate, as if the cost of survival had made them softer, or maybe just quieter in their own minds. No one mentioned the night before. No one spoke of the shed, the alder, or the girl, but everyone noticed the spot in the field where the frost did not return, where the grass bent always inward, like a wound still closing. The silence had lifted, but something else had settled in its place. A fragile calm, thin as paper, easily torn. They had bought time. They had paid in bloodless guilt and collective denial. And now, the land had loosened its grip. Children played again, though they never strayed north. The bell remained unrung. The church reopened, though the back pews were always left empty. It was understood. Some debts don't end. They pause. And Salem, in its oldest breath, knew this wasn't the end. It was a reprieve, a held breath, a closing of the eyes before they open again in a darker season. But for now the ground was still, the frost was gone. The curse, like the girl, was buried, just beneath the surface. just beyond the reach of memory. And for a time, that was enough. It didn't happen all at once. Her name wasn't struck from records or scratched from stones. It simply began to vanish, quietly, efficiently, like ink dissolving in water. The church ledgers were the first. A page torn out, another smudged beyond recognition. The attendance book from the winter before showed no Marjorie, no notes beside her shed, no mention of charity offered or meals delivered. The schoolhouse roster listed her only once, and even then the line looked faint, half erased, as if the pencil had lifted itself mid-letter. In the market no one could remember what she used to eat. At the well, no one could recall her voice. They spoke of the girl now, never naming her, never needing to. The frost had lifted, the curse had quieted, and in return, the memory was being taken too, as if remembrance itself was part of the debt. Even the cooper's shed began to rot faster than the others, its door fallen inward. The bed, frame rusted through. Children walked past it without asking. Mothers no longer warned them to stay away. They didn't need to. There was nothing to remember. Only the faint echo of something having once stood there. Something not fully real. The minister rewrote the baptism logs, omitting names he didn't recognize. The elders cleaned the church archives and found nothing out of place. A year later, when asked by a visitor how many children lived in the quarter that winter, no one could agree. Some said 21, others said 20. No one said 22. The silence surrounding her became its own kind of truth. And in Salem, truth was always built on what people refused to say. The grave had no marker. The field held no sign. And even those who had watched her buried alive would later blink when asked if they remembered her face. Not out of cruelty, but out of survival. Because to speak her name might call her back. And to call her back might mean the frost would rise again. So they forgot, willingly, faithfully, completely. But memory doesn't die. It waits. And beneath the alder, beneath the softened earth, something still held the shape of a name never meant to vanish. It cracked just after sunset, 2 years to the day since the frost had lifted. No storm, no wind, no warning, just a sharp, wet sound, like bone giving way, echoing through the empty field. The alder had split down its centre, clean as if by axe, though no blade had touched it. The trunk opened like a mouth trying to speak after a long silence, revealing a core that pulsed with something too dark to be sap. It dripped slowly, thick, red-black, warm even in the evening chill. Not a leak, a release, as though what had been sealed inside was finally allowed to breathe. The townsfolk found it the next morning. None dared step too close. The bark around the wound curled inward, not like rot, but like fingers pulled back in pain. And from the split came a scent none could name. Sweet, metallic, sharp enough to sting the eyes. Some said it smelled like iron. Others, like the cradle of a cellar that had held too much sorrow. Beneath the tree, the grass had curled in upon itself, yellowed and wet, as though the ground no longer recognized what lived above it. A child touched the sap and screamed, not from pain, from recognition. His hand was clean, but he swore something had moved beneath his skin. The alder stood taller now, somehow, straighter despite the wound, like it had grown stronger from being broken open. The roots stretched wider. The field grew quieter. And by nightfall, every dog in Salem refused to bark. The church bell trembled in its tower, though no wind touched the steeple. The people didn't gather. They didn't discuss. They simply watched, from porches and windows, waiting to see what the tree would do next. But the alder did nothing more. It bled. Silently, consistently, as if something inside had not been destroyed, only stirred. It hadn't rejected the offering. It had absorbed it. And now, The crack down its heart pulsed like a second heartbeat beneath the soil. The curse had not ended. It had begun to grow. They began walking just after the alder split. Children, no older than 10, leaving their beds in the hours before dawn, barefoot and silent, eyes open but unseeing. They stepped lightly over floorboards, opened doors without sound, and moved as if drawn by something old and familiar. Always toward the field, always toward the alder. Parents woke to empty rooms and open shutters, to muddy prints trailing out the door, always barefoot, always heading north. They'd find their children at the edge of the tree line, standing still in the frost, lips parted, breath fogging the air. No memory of how they got there. No fear. Just that vacant calm, like something had borrowed them for a little while. The first few incidents were dismissed as sleepwalking, but then they began to speak, not while awake, but in dreams, muttering phrases they had no way to know, names that hadn't been spoken in generations, rhythms that echoed the old ritual, the one Salem had tried to forget. A girl was found at the base of the alder with her hands in the soil, nails bloodied, whispering a single word over and over. Her parents said she'd never learned to speak before that night. Another child carved circles into the frost with her toes, eyes wide, humming a lullaby no one recognized, and always before they woke, they whispered a name, not clearly, not always aloud, but those close enough to hear understood. It was her, Marjorie, the girl no one remembered, but everyone had buried. The one whose name had been swallowed by silence, now slipped from the mouths of those too young to know better. The townsfolk began locking their doors, sprinkling salt across windowsills, lighting candles at all hours. But the children still walked, not nightly, just often enough to unsettle the air. And the alder, split and seeping, seemed to lean forward now, like it was listening. The frost around it never melted. And in the morning light, small impressions, barefoot, light, meandering, would remain in the soil, as if someone had come to visit, or as if something beneath had reached up, just enough to remind them it still knew the way home. It began with a tilt, a single headstone, leaning slightly east. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth panic. But within weeks, more followed. Graves across the churchyard, some old, some newly filled, began to shift. The soil sank unevenly, not from rain, not from rot, but from something deeper. Entire rows tilted inward, as though being drawn toward a single point underground. The church tried to explain it with erosion, frost heave, poor masonry, but the pattern was unmistakable. The closer the grave to the alder, the more violently it leaned. Stones cracked, crosses split. Even the iron fence along the cemetery's edge began to bow, as if the dead themselves had turned in their sleep. One gravedigger, older than most, claimed he heard it one night, bones clicking beneath the dirt like branches snapping in a storm. Another refused to work the northern section altogether, saying the ground there felt hollow, like skin stretched too tight, over something moving underneath. It wasn't just the dead that shifted. The names on the stones began to fade, not from weather, but as if something beneath had begun to feed on the memory itself. Carvings that had stood sharp for decades blurred in days. Dates blurred first, then names, then nothing. In the oldest corner, a child's grave simply crumbled to dust overnight, leaving no trace but a dent in the grass. The town said little, but the funerals grew shorter. Bodies were buried farther south, even if it meant crossing the river. The bell tolled less. The mourning was quieter, because even in grief they felt it. Something beneath was stirring, not in malice, not in haste, but in hunger, slow, patient, methodical. As if Marjorie's bones had not been buried alone, as if whatever accepted her had begun to draw others in, Not the living, not yet, but the forgotten. The ones already claimed by the earth. The dead were being rearranged, pulled inward, recalled, and the alder, black-streaked and gaping, stood at the center of it all, its roots moving deeper, curling beneath names, threading through coffins, tightening their grip. The town didn't speak it aloud, but they all knew. Salem was no longer letting go of its dead. It rang once, clear, sharp, hollow. At precisely 3 minutes past midnight, the sound cracked through Salem like lightning without a storm, echoing off rooftops, rattling shutters, waking every soul in the northern quarter from uneasy sleep. The church bell had not been touched in years. Its rope had long since rotted, its clapper rusted solid. The tower itself was sealed, the ladder removed, the key to the door lost or burned or buried by design. Yet the sound it made could not be mistaken. It was not wind, not imagination. It was a toll, measured, perfect, impossibly loud. The next morning they inspected the tower. The bell hadn't moved. The rust hadn't cracked. The silence inside the steeple was thick as stone. But everyone had heard it. A child had cried out seconds before it rang, screaming from a dream that Marjorie had opened her mouth and the sound came from her throat. Another child, already halfway to the alder by the time his mother found him barefoot in the snow, whispered that the bell had not rung from above. It had rung from beneath. The elders didn't speak of it. The minister simply left a note on the pulpit the following Sunday. "Do not fear what reminds us." No one asked what it meant. They didn't need to. The bell had been a seal once, a warning, a weight. Its silence was not tradition. It was containment. And now it had broken, or been called. The townsfolk lit candles in daylight. They spoke softer indoors. A sense of waiting thickened the air again. Not dread, exactly, but anticipation. As if a threshold had been crossed in the night. As if the sound had not marked a beginning, but the return of something old, something that remembered. Because bells do not toll without cause. And in Salem, sound is never just sound. It is signal. It is reply. It is the ground reminding those who live above it that nothing buried stays silent forever. The alder did not move that night, but the frost deepened at its base. And far below the steeple, beyond the reach of rope or hand, the bell waited, silent once more, but never empty. They tried to contain it. First with a fence, tall, iron, sharp-tipped, encircling the alder like a pen around a beast they dared not name. It was blessed, painted, bolted deep into the soil, and for a season it held. The children stopped sleepwalking. The frost paused. The dreams dulled. But by spring, rust had spread across every post, even the ones not touched by rain. Birds died on the crossbars. And one morning, the eastern gate lay folded inward, as if it had never been built to keep anything out. So they built a wall. Stone stacked 6 feet high, sealed with mortar mixed with salt, ash, and scripture. It rose overnight. Dozens of hands working in silence, none of them meeting each other's eyes. No celebration followed, just a long, cold hush. But the wall didn't keep still. Within weeks, cracks appeared along the base, not from pressure above, but from shifting below. The ground had started to breathe again, roots pressed against the stones like fingers pushing through cloth. The southern corner bowed inward, and every 7th night, a deep sound rose from the earth, not loud, not violent, but rhythmic, like something large moving slowly beneath miles of soil. The town pretended not to hear it. They lit candles. They stayed indoors. And yet, one by one, families began to leave. Not loudly, not as warnings, just gone. Doors left open, houses stripped bare, salt scattered across thresholds like parting words. The exodus came without announcement, and those who stayed behind grew quieter with every departure. Streets emptied, Stores closed. The market shrank to a single stall. No bells rang. No services held. Even the birds stopped nesting in the eaves. The wall still stands. The fence still rusts. But both are empty gestures now. Monuments not to protection, but to failure. The alder weeps less often now, but the air around it hums, low and constant, like breath, just beneath the surface. No one visits the field. No one speaks of the girl. And yet the silence she left behind has filled every room, every mouth, every prayer. Salem did not forget. It simply built louder structures to drown the memory. But fences bend, walls sink, and silence always finds its way back to the root. It always begins the same way. The seventh winter arrives without a storm. No omen, no thunder, just stillness, unnatural, complete, like the world is holding its breath again. The air sharpens. The frost returns not in patterns but in symbols, curling into circles across glass panes and gravestones. Animals stop breeding. Wells grow quiet. The alder, even if left unwatched, begins to bleed beneath the bark. And somewhere, always somewhere, a child begins to hum. Not a song, a cadence, low and even, like the rhythm of a lullaby no one taught them, the seventh wind. Air is not announced, it is remembered, felt in the joints of the old, in the bones of the town itself. Salem does not mark the calendar anymore. The pattern marks them, and every seventh year, without fail, it reawakens. The fields freeze deeper. The church bell rattles though the tower remains sealed. Doors begin sticking. Pipes crack in silence, and a name no one speaks begins to stir at the back of every throat. Children draw circles in the frost with their fingers. Elders stare too long into the woods. It doesn't matter how much they build, how far they expand. The seventh winter always finds its way back to the heart of town. It never rages. It waits. Quiet, familiar, patient. Those who remained, the few who never fled, light candles and say nothing. They salt their windowsills. They whisper prayers they no longer believe in. Not to God, to the ground. Because Salem has learned what most towns never dare accept. Curses do not vanish. They cycle. They rest. And when they rise, they do so with more memory than the men who buried them. The alder does not move. The earth does not open. But everything tightens, as if the roots remember the timing, as if the land itself counts the years, the names, the offerings. And in every seventh winter, the town becomes a reflection of what it fears most, a place rehearsing the moment it will give again. Not because it must, but because it always has. They always forget. That's part of the cost. Each new generation arrives like clean parchment, unmarked by the frost, unburdened by the silence that came before. They hear the stories in fragments, if at all. A ghost tale, a caution, something whispered after too much drink. But never the truth, never the ledger of names, never the shape of the ritual. And so they grow bold. They question. They clear the brush near the alder. They paint the fence. They let their children play in the field. Some even laugh at the wall, call it folklore, superstition, rot made sacred by old minds. They don't mean harm. They mean to move forward. But in Salem, forgetting is not healing. It is erasure. And erasure is what feeds the root. The frost comes quicker when they stop remembering. The signs return faster. The dreams come louder. One girl begins humming without knowing why. A boy carves circles into a desk at school, eyes glassy, hands trembling. The well darkens. The livestock stall. And someone, always someone, finds themselves walking barefoot toward the tree without memory of how they got there. The curse does not punish, it simply returns. Each forgetting resets the cycle, shortens the peace. The land is patient, but not blind. It watches how quickly memory fades, how eagerly truth is paved over in favor of comfort. And when enough time passes, when no one remembers the girl, or the frost, or the sound the bell made, it reaches again. Not to strike, to claim, to remind, because the price of forgetting is always repetition. And each time, the offering is taken more easily, more efficiently, more cleanly, until someday there may be no resistance at all. Just a town that understands what must be done and does it without pause. No fear, no mourning, no names, just tradition. Passed not through scripture but through soil. The elders no longer warn the young no longer ask. And when the seventh winter comes again, there will be fewer questions, fewer voices, fewer memories standing in the way of sacrifice. Because in Salem, forgetting isn't the end of the curse, it's how the curse survives. Marjorie was not the first. That truth came slow, unearthed like rot behind plaster. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. The signs had been there all along. Ledger gaps, missing census lines, tombs without bodies. Too many unnamed children marked simply as lost. The town had always spoken of one offering, one curse, one frost. But it was never one. It was a line, a rhythm, a tradition dressed in silence. Each generation, it seemed, had found its own Marjorie. A different face, a different name. Each one forgotten the same way. Scrubbed, softened, sacrificed. And beneath it all a sickening symmetry. Always a girl, always without kin, always just before the thaw. The realization didn't come with screams or horror. It came with stillness. A shared breath held too long. The kind of silence that makes you realize you've spoken the same lie your entire life. That Salem was not cursed. It was complicit. The frost was not an affliction. It was a calendar, a reminder, a clock wound by blood. Some of the oldest families began comparing stories, bits passed down. A name never repeated, a lullaby no one could place. One man found an old prayer hidden inside a family Bible, its last line reading, "She was enough, for now." And suddenly the soil itself seemed more honest than the people walking on it, the graves that had no stones, the children who vanished in stories no one finished telling. They had called it mercy, they had called it balance, but it was always fear. Fear dressed as piety, fear sanctified into obedience. And once that pattern was seen, it could never be unseen. Marjorie had not broken the cycle. She was part of it. A name in a long line of offerings made to something that never demanded a voice, only a body. And the most horrifying truth was not that it had happened before. It was that every time they'd done it, it had worked. The frost had lifted, the birds had returned, the children had been born strong. And that success, more than any curse, was what doomed them to repeat it. Again and again. Life paid for with silence. They found it behind the wall, deep in the church's southern wing, where the stone met timber and the draught never left. A false panel, nailed shut and forgotten, gave way beneath the weight of rot. Behind it, a box wrapped in oilcloth, brittle with age, and bound by twine that broke like ash in the hand. Inside was the ledger, hand-stitched, bound in leather, the spine cracked with every touch. It contained no title, no scripture, just names, dates, locations, and beneath each, a single word, given. The entries stretched back further than Salem's founding. Some bore initials, others only symbols. But the pattern was clear. Every 7 years, always winter, always a child without claim. The handwriting changed, but the rhythm did not. Even the earliest pages bore the same structure, stark, precise, unashamed. One page read simply, "She walked willingly." Another, "They wept, but they agreed, Nat." Or the middle, pressed between two brittle sheets, was a lock of hair. Pale, thread-thin, still smelling faintly of smoke. No one claimed to know who found it. No one said how it came into their hands, but once the ledger appeared, it passed through the town like a plague. Each set of eyes that read it grew heavier, mouths tightened, postures stiffened. There was no denial, only stillness. The elders stopped attending church. The candles were no longer lit, and the pulpit remained empty. Because the ledger told the truth, no one had dared say aloud. The curse was not imposed. It was managed, recorded, preserved. The church had been its keeper, not in faith, but in fear. A sacred role built not to protect life, but to ensure the cycle remained unbroken. The rituals had not faded with time. They had been written down, improved, perfected, until the offering of one became the preservation of many. The walls of the church now felt closer, the air inside colder. Not holy, hollow, not sanctuary, system. The ledger still exists, though no one admits to holding it. Pages are missing now, torn, burned. But enough remains. Enough to know the curse was never supernatural. It was tradition, documented, repeated, worshipped. And if something that cruel can be maintained for centuries, then perhaps the land was never cursed at all. Perhaps it simply became what they made of it. It started in chalk, a single drawing on the side of the schoolhouse, simple, childlike, barely more than a stick figure. A girl, barefoot in a field of frost, her mouth a thin line, her eyes just two empty circles. One hand pointed upward. No one knew who drew it. No one claimed it. But by the following week, it appeared again. On the inside of a desk, scratched into the dirt behind the cooper's shed, carved faintly into the underside of a pew, always the same shape, always the same girl. Teachers began confiscating the drawings. Parents scrubbed them from walls, but they came back, not copied, identical, as though each image was not drawn, but remembered. Some children spoke of her in dreams, said she sang to them, though her mouth never moved, said she pointed, not at them, but at something behind them, something buried. One boy, feverish and pale, whispered that she was counting, not aloud, with her eyes, each blink a tally, each glance a measure of who would be next. Another girl, too young to spell her own name, traced a perfect circle in the frost and whispered a phrase no one recognized, a cadence that matched the old ritual, syllable for syllable. The town tried to bury it. Again. They punished drawings, burned desks, salted thresholds, but the refrain had returned, not in voices, in rhythm. The same melody hummed through hallways, the same symbol in every child's hand. They called it mass hysteria, infection of the mind. But the frost deepened. The alder wept anew. And on the seventh night, a new image appeared, larger than the rest, drawn in ash on the inside of the church's locked door. The girl again, but now her hand pointed straight ahead, at the viewer, at the town, not in warning, in accusation. They had erased her name, but children remember what silence cannot bury. And Marjorie, forgotten by records, erased, by ritual, had returned, not with vengeance, but with presence, in every drawing, every hum, every breath held too long. She was no longer waiting to be remembered. She was teaching them how. They tried everything. Salt first, poured in thick lines around the alder, across the field, along every threshold facing north. but it dissolved overnight, leaving the soil wet and darker than before. Then came fire. Controlled burns, they said. A cleansing. Flames that circled the bleeding tree but never touched it. The bark remained untouched, unblistered, weeping just as before. The ash cooled too fast. The smoke didn't rise. When that failed, they turned to Scripture. Psalms shouted from the pulpit, crosses nailed into every beam. Holy water poured into the cracks of the shifting cemetery. But the frost came back heavier the next morning, layered thick over the gravestones like breath crystallized in stone. And the alder? Its split had widened, not broken, just enough to reveal something deeper within. Not hollow, not dead, breathing, waiting. A child was baptized twice in 1 week. A minister spent 3 days fasting in the bell tower, hoping that prayer might choke the hum beneath the soil. But on the 4th night, the church doors were found open, the tower empty. His boots left neatly on the steps. He never returned. The people whispered that maybe it wasn't evil they were trying to cleanse, but memory. Maybe what lingered wasn't a curse, but a conscience that refused to die. The blood couldn't be washed because it had never been spilled. It had been buried, quietly, systematically, with soft hands and shut mouths. And now it rose, not in rage, but in permanence. On the chapel floor, the stain kept returning. A dark, rusted bloom near the altar that no bristle could erase. Paint peeled faster there. Candles refused to stay lit. And when a child pressed her palm against the wood, she began to weep without knowing why. The elders stopped attending. The wall cracked again. The field stayed empty. Not because they feared the curse, but because they knew now what it was. Not punishment, not wrath, just consequence. The kind that lives in wood grain, in root, in silence. And no salt, no fire, no scripture would ever touch it. Because Salem had tried to cleanse what it refused to name. And now the land was clean, but the people were stained. In the end, it wasn't the tree. It wasn't the frost. It wasn't even the curse. It was the town. Salem had built the ritual, maintained it, justified it. Not with blood, but with silence. With every child they ignored, every ledger they altered, every name they chose not to speak. The hunger they feared was not buried beneath the alder. It was in them, in their willingness to trade innocence for survival, to call cruelty tradition, to let a girl die without protest because she had no one left to love her. They had always blamed the land, the tree, the air. But it was the town that devoured Marjorie, and all the other Shez before her. The frost was never the enemy. It was the mirror. It showed them what they truly were when the wind grew cold and the days grew short. A people who would murder mercy to preserve comfort, who would bury their sins in a child and then forget her name like it made them clean. The curse didn't kill Salem. Salem became its own curse, self-fed, self-justified, beautifully organized around a horror so old it looked like heritage. Even now, those who remain keep their heads down. They teach their children to be quiet, to never walk alone, and if the frost comes again, they will bury another. Not because they want to, because they believe they must, because that's what the town has always done. Not once, not in legend, but in rhythm, in seasons, in names lost to stone. And somewhere beneath the earth, beneath the bleeding alder, beneath the cracked wall and the shifting graves, Marjorie waits, not as a ghost, not as vengeance, but as memory itself, too quiet to be heard, too deep to be ignored. She is not gone. She is woven into the pattern, into the fields, into the bell that rings without sound. Because in Salem, the dead are never what haunt you. It's the living, the ones who stayed, the ones who watched, the ones who called it mercy and kept on digging. And if this story held you, it's because part of you already knew. Salem is not the only place that forgets what it buries. There are other towns, other names, other silences shaped like tradition. Subscribe to the Macabre Record, because we are not done remembering.